I say common, you say ground. Common.
Ground.
Common.
Ground.
It is so great to see all of you here, new people who have been to a lot of our events over the last 3 years. New people who have not been to our events a lot. You can tell I'm nervous. And former folks who have been returning supporting for the last 3 years. My name is Ronald Towns, and I am one of the proud co-founders of Camp Common Ground.
My name is Zach Bell. I'm the other very proud co-founder and co-director with Ron.
Thank you. And tonight is actually our first time doing this type of event, a community roundtable, where we actually surface the issue of why we were founded in the first place. And I know that all of us, come from different sectors. Some of us are educators, some of us are in the foundation world, some of us are in housing, youth development, policy, or none of those. But we all are gathering here because we care about this really important issue that has been surfaced in the media over the last few years. But this is the first time, to our knowledge, that it has really been where a group of people have intentionally come together to actually not only talk about it, learn about the challenges, but also try to develop some action steps that we can do as a community to move the work forward. Tonight we're gonna start with a little bit about why we're here, a little bit about our experience. Then we're gonna share a little bit about the research of what is going on in the Bay Area right now to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're gonna hear from an incredible group of panelists who are in the work and are gonna help us understand what are the challenges and give us some guidance on what are some of the potential solutions to this issue of school and community segregation. So 5 years ago, I moved here from Chicago, and I've only been to Oakland for, 5 years ago. And I actually moved to work here at Envision Academy. So I taught 9th grade Algebra 1 and Math Intervention with Mr. Patnod, Dustin. 5 years ago, moved all the way from Chicago. When I moved here, one of the first students who I met was Kevin Sanchez. And Kevin is now, he is a senior at Envision, and I'm very proud of him, but Kevin was a trip. Kevin, not only did I have him in Algebra 1 class, Math Intervention class, but I also have him in my advisor. So I saw Kevin 3 hours a day, which for a high school teacher is a lot of time. And one day, Kevin came into advisory, and I was just like, in advisory, if you've ever been to school, advisory is like where you check in with kids, that social emotional stuff. And I was like, Kevin, how was your weekend? And he was like, Towns, it was not that great. And I was like, well, what's not great about it? He was like, Towns, well, I thought about the event that we're all preparing for. So let me give some background. Our advisory was a program called Build. And so we were going to an event where we were competing against kids from around the Bay Area, most of whom are not at urban schools. And so at this particular event, most of the kids were gonna be at private schools, and mostly gonna be white and Asian students. And this school, Envision, serves all Black and Latino students, mostly from low-income backgrounds. So Kevin was telling me after weeks of preparing, we have been doing this for weeks, months, and he was like, Towns, I'm not going. I was like, Kevin, and if you know me as a teacher, that strikes a bell. I'm like, what do you mean you're not going, Kevin? Of course you are. And he told me something that I will always remember, both as an educator, but also just as a human, is I'm not going because I know what they're gonna think about me. I know they don't expect me to do well, so I'm not gonna set myself up for failure. And what Kevin was saying, Kevin is Mexican American, and what he was saying was his perception was that the white other students and community that was gonna be there in particular, they already viewed him as not as competent, not as capable, and so he wasn't gonna put himself through that. And my only response, I was a little bit shocked, because as a teacher, you're like, oh, when a kid says that, you kind of want to wrap your arms around them, but you're not really sure what to say, so you just come up with something to say in the moment that sounds good. And what I said in that moment was, Kevin, that's not true. Let me tell you, I have a lot of white friends, and they don't think that way. And I said, Kevin, I have developed great relationships with people who are white, and I know that they think of me equally as they would you. Something like that, to kind of move him forward. He eventually ended up going to the event, etc. That was not a satisfactory answer, and here's why for me it wasn't. As a Black man, and as someone who grew up on the west side of Detroit, I'm not from Oakland, as I said, what Kevin was saying resonated with me, because that was the same thing that my mother and my aunt and the woman who raised me had told me in my household 20 years earlier. And they had told me that, you know, you have to be better just to be considered average because they are going to not view you as the same. You're gonna have to prove yourself. Do not bring a white person home to date. Do not, like, those were words that came in my house and of the households of my black friends and a lot of the students who I serve. For me, as one of the directors of Camp Common Ground, I know that there are many kids who look like me who are having those same conversations in their household, and those are their experiences that are real. And what we've tried to think about is, how do we bring kids together intentionally, given that our schools are so segregated, so they're not meeting people from different backgrounds in their schools or communities? How do we have them build meaningful relations across cultural lines so that they can move past the stereotypes that they're receiving in their homes and communities?
One of the things that I really love and feel was so powerful and special about this work is that it matters who you are and your identity. You bring that into this work. And Ron and I have different perspectives on why we came into this, and we talk about it all the time. For me, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, Jewish family, upper middle class. And even though I didn't receive necessarily like negative messages explicitly about other groups, I definitely had very clear messages of who is in my community and who is not. I was sent to Jewish summer camp for 10 years, which I loved, but was a very intentional effort. My dad told me he was sending me there so I would meet a Jewish girl to marry. I was like 8. And in high school, they wouldn't let me date someone who wasn't Jewish. I fortunately grew up in a city and felt, you know, more comfortable than some other folks might. But when I got to UPenn in Philadelphia, which is there, it felt like the racial tensions and the discomfort was at a different level. And Penn has a historically bad relationship with West Philadelphia, predominantly an historically black community. A lot of folks have been displaced as it expanded further west. And actually even the neighborhood used to be called Black Bottom, was then renamed University City. So there was a displacement and erasure, right? And what was so difficult too was that the messaging was very clear from Penn. We actually had to, during orientation, watch a video about a Penn student from like 10 years before who had been shot when she was in West Philadelphia, not fatally, but it was this very clear message of don't go past 40th Street, they are dangerous, they are different, they're not part of our community. And so I felt like for those 4 years I walked and watched interactions like, it sort of felt like I saw this on repeat, some, you know, like an affluent white kid on his way to a frat party stepping around or over a homeless black person. Obviously that exact scenario didn't happen every time, but that's what it felt like being there. And I didn't know what to do. I was probably self-righteous and was like, this is wrong, because I just knew something wasn't right there. Because to me, for that to make sense, it has to be in a world where you don't view that person as fully human, or at the very least, not in your community. And then when I started working in schools, I was at University City High School my junior year summer, which has now been shut down. And I became close with this high school student, Martez. He was only a few years younger than me because I was in college. And he was really likable and social and athletic, but was pretty quiet around academics. And we were doing a final project, and it was the first time I'd seen him write. And he wouldn't start writing. And he finally started putting out like a sentence, and it was honestly very hard to understand and hard to read. And in that moment, my mind went, this black boy is lazy. Or he's just dumb. And realizing myself that this is a boy I even really liked, and I'm a well-intentioned white person. These are not things that are easy to deconstruct. And so I thought in my head, like, how can we have a situation where we actually construct those differently, and where that, whether it's that person on the street or Martez or whatever, where it's not an other, but someone who really feels like part of our community. And one last thing I'll say is that something that also happened as I got older was there was someone from my Jewish community who really did struggle, who got kicked out of multiple schools, had substance abuse issues, was in trouble with the law, and people in our community gave him second, third, fourth, fifth chances because he was one of us. And we weren't going to abandon them. And I just wondered what would be required for people to feel that way about people who don't look like them, aren't technically in their community. And so that's, I feel like, where Camp Common Ground came from for me. And I feel so honored to be able to do it with Ron.
Same here. Well, we're gonna. We talk about our experiences, and when we founded Camp Conrad, we were like, okay, are these just Zach and Ron's experiences, or are these like real issues, right? Like other people's experiences. So then we did our homework, and so we pulled together just some brief slides just to make sure we all understand the lay of the land. Right now in OUSD, so for those of you who are not at OUSD, that's Oakland Unified School District, and that is the public school system in Oakland. Oakland Achieves, which is a coalition of educators, came together in 2014, and they started studying patterns of segregation in Oakland. What they looked at was which students are staying in OUSD from kindergarten through 12th grade, which ones are not, and when are they leaving, like what are the patterns? What they found was that, and sorry the y-axis here is kind of blurry, but basically that Asian and white families are keeping their kids in OUSD up until 5th grade. Up until 5th grade. So really in 6th grade, which is when middle school begins, half of Asian and white students who were previously in OUSD are no longer there. By contrast, Black and Latino students, or the families of Black and Latino students are keeping their Black and Latino students in school, in OUSD schools. The percentage is about 80%, 70 to 80% a given year. So those students in middle school are experiencing racial segregation for the first time in their school. So middle school is really the time in Oakland where we're seeing this divide in our schools, and you can literally, and we'll look at a map later, Zach's gonna move us through that. You can see a map that shows by racial category where folks are. And that is why at Camp Conrad we actually focus intentionally on middle schoolers, and we'll talk about what we do with them. We also thought about, okay, so we have the racial factor. What about class? Are there any intersections between race and class? And there are. KQED in 2016 had our former superintendent of OUSD on the radio show to speak about this, and that superintendent reported that 72% of Black students and 80% of Latino students in OUSD have classmates from low-income backgrounds, versus 37% of their white counterparts have low-income, have peers from low-income backgrounds. So also, when we get to middle school, we're seeing this class divide where we have kids from Black and Latino communities are also experiencing class segregation, and their white counterparts are not having the same level of class segregation as the Black and Latino students. So you may be asking, okay, if kids aren't going to school together, they're not living together, where are they getting their information about people who don't look like them, right, or from different backgrounds? Well, like Zach and I talked about, we got it from our families, right, they get it from the communities, but because where we are, they also get it from media, right, huge thing. Common Sense Media last year did a study on Bay Area, so this is not just Oakland, but Bay Area, middle and high school students, and they asked them, would you agree with certain statements? Half of the youth who were surveyed agreed with the following statement, that whenever I see a Black or Latino person in the news, they're usually involved in crimes, violence, or other problems. After asking this question or these set of statements, Common Sense Media researchers also asked, how does that influence your perception, or studied how does that influence their perception of kids from that racial group? And they found that there is a strong correlation between what kids saw in the media about Black and Latino youth and their beliefs, which are mostly negative, associated with crime, violence, other problems, et cetera, through a series of implicit bias tests that they did. So we see that our kids are getting information about kids who don't look like them or from different places than them from other sources that are not from actual people.
Anyone here a visual learner? Any visual learners in the audience? Oh, right, a lot. Has anyone ever seen a map that looks like this? A couple people? So on the left was University of Virginia. Folks did a dot map study using the 2010 census data. The color's a little hard to see here, but one dot is for one person, and they're colored according to race. So the blue dots are white folks, and you can see that's essentially the hills and in Piedmont. Then black is green, and that's sort of West Oakland and East Oakland. Asian is red, and that's sort of around the lake and in Chinatown, and Hispanic is mostly in deep East Oakland. This was a few years ago, we found this map. We were doing like our first promo video about this camp, and we were both kind of shocked. Like, we knew it was bad, but you could show this to an elementary school student, and they'd be like, oh yeah, the blue people live up there, and the red people and the orange and the green. It really is that stark. And we'll talk maybe a little bit later about how housing and all that relates to school segregation, but here's a really cool, you can see the map over here, which is of schools. So this was done by researchers at UC Berkeley and was reported out by SF Gate. And the darker, this is in Oakland Unified, the darker purple indicates a greater percentage of Black or Hispanic children. Again, extremely stark, right? East Oakland, a little bit into West Oakland, and then the hills are predominantly white.
And so just briefly, we want to talk about a little about what we do and how our work is actually not enough, and hence why we're here tonight. So we work on the youth development side, and we know that that is not enough, but we want to spend a little bit of time speaking quickly about what we do. We basically are like, we cannot change school attendance boundaries. We don't have the power to do that, but we can provide alternative spaces for kids to intentionally build relationships across cultural lines. So we basically spend the school year recruiting 30 to 40 kids from about 30 different communities. They represent different racial, economic groups, different communities in the Bay Area, and we bring them to our summer camp. And so it's called Camp Common Ground, but it's not just, we do like the canoeing, the archery, the hiking, so kids can build organically build meaningful relationships. But we actually have a curriculum where we intentionally teach a set of skills to get them not only to be, to change their perspective about others who don't look like them, but also to not only do that, but to lead change efforts around integration when they leave us. And could you go to the next slide, Zach? So basically we divide our curriculum into 3 buckets. One is called knowledge. So we teach our kids about identity. So the things Zach and I mentioned, and also how does identity influence our perspective on the world. In middle school, if you've ever worked with a middle schooler, a lot of times this is their first time hearing about identity and what that means. We then are like, okay, so we understand that identity influences our perspective. Now, how do we develop empathy for people who are not from the same places as us, who don't look like us? So we've identified 2 skills that we feel like are middle school appropriate: active listening to build those relationships, and sharing vulnerably to build those relationships. So if you've ever worked with middle schoolers, you know both of those can be challenging, right? Getting them to do that. But we believe that those are 2 very important skills for them to build relationships across lines with people who don't look like them. And then the final part of the curriculum is the doing part. So we really feel that it's not enough for them to just come to our camp. And we don't have the capacity to serve hundreds of kids in Oakland, but we do have the capacity to train our kids to indirectly impact their peers. And so what they do is they go home after camp, right? And they write what's called a plan for disruption. And so what that is, it's a piece of paper. And it's a plan. It lists another kid's name in their school. They list the social norm that excludes that kid. So they'll say maybe it's around race in their school, around class. One girl, Indigo, in our program, she wrote about a boy who's Black. He's the only Black boy in her class, and how he is excluded, viewed by the teachers and students as really loud, obnoxious, etc. And then she lists what are her action steps based on what she learned at Camp Common Ground. We meet with Indigo and our cohort of 30 kids 3 times during the school year, where they share that plan, they give feedback to each other on that plan, and they present their plan to the next group of kids who come in the following year. So that's kind of our work, but we also understand that that is not enough. We are thinking about how at a systems level do we address this issue.
Yeah, so let's get to it. These are going to be our main focal questions tonight. What are the challenges and barriers to integration, what's already being done, what still needs to be done, and what can we do about it. And we are just so thrilled to have this honestly amazing set of panelists. I'm so grateful to have you all here. And this incredible group of people in the room. There's so much brain power and action potential in the room right now.
So first we're gonna have a whole group panel, then we'll have some brief small group discussions, and then we'll have a whole group closing tonight. That'll be pretty straightforward. All right, so meet the panelists. First is the mic working. Aaron, can you check the mic to make sure it actually works?
Hello.
Awesome, perfect. First, before we get further, could you just go down the line and just say your name and what your role or position is, just so we all know?
Hi, my name is Aaron Watson. I'm the principal of Gateway Middle School in San Francisco.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan Osler. I'm an educator, and I have 2 children in OUSD elementary schools.
My name is Jamoke Hinton Hodge, and I'm on the school board for Oakland Unified School District, and I represent District 3, West Oakland neighborhood.
Hello friends, my name is Abel Guillen. I'm a council member for District 2 in Oakland. District 2 is the most diverse district in Oakland that encompasses Chinatown, Eastlake, San Antonio, Crocker Highlands, Trestle Glen, the big part of Oakland, and it reflects the diversity of the city.
Good evening, my name is Bray Connor. I'm a staff attorney with the ACLU of Northern California.
Thank you, thank you. Just a few kind of ground rules. We're gonna do questions at the end of the panel. Just write notes to yourself if you have a question, and we'll try to get to you. And then panelists, feel free to I'm gonna pose a question, but feel free to talk to each other, right? You don't need to wait for me. And feel free to be honest and open about your perspective, all right? Zach, are we good? Anything else you think we need to say?
I have a question.
Yeah, Jamal.
Sorry. Is this a clarifying technical clarity thing? Is it 6:45? And the panel is supposed to be over at 6:45? And then we're going to do small groups, so did I miss a memo of changing?
Oh yeah, so we had just some difficulty at the beginning, so we just started a little bit late. So we'll just push back. We'll end at 8, but we'll push back the small group start time.
So no small, okay.
Yeah, it'll just be shorter. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for asking. All right, so the first question is, why do you see this as such a critical issue?
So I think that, talking about integration, school, desegregation, and really discussing these issues is really all centered on racial justice. And I think that in the climate where we are right now, considering, who our Secretary of Education is, the administration, that it's created an even more hostile school environment for students. And so it's really important for individuals in the community to stand up and stand together to make sure that students feel safe and welcome in their school districts, and to also, kind of learn from where we are now, so that hopefully in the future we don't have to repeat the mistakes that we clearly are making right now. And I think that, there is a lot of opportunity for us to examine how students and educators and community members can come together to fix some of the issues here locally, and also kind of fix some of the issues regarding discrimination and things like that happen in the community. And I think we'll probably talk more about that later.
So I agree with Aubrey, and I want to say that education in America, in this country, particularly in California, has traditionally been a way of economic opportunity. So the more education you make, and that's actually in the UC mission statement, right? The University of California says that we are built to serve the people of the state of California, so the people of California. And unfortunately, that opportunity of segregation gets recreated through our system of education. So it begins, and I reflect upon my own personal experience growing up in San Francisco, in the Mission District, going to public schools and seeing the segregation that would play out. It was no surprise that from middle school, a lot of my friends, Asian and white kids that went to my school, went to the more elite high school, if you will, Lowell High School. And then a lot of the black and brown kids, where we ended up, was McAteer School of Art, Soda. And so that sort of segregation kind of plays out in our system of higher education as well. So it gets replicated from our K through 12 level all the way through our community colleges, our UCs, and Cal State system. So you look at our community colleges, who does the community college teach? It mostly enrolls Latino students and mostly African American students. And you look at UC and who is enrolled there. And so when you talk about economic opportunity, there are hardly any African Americans at UC Berkeley. There's a couple of campuses with some exceptions, but the bulk of our students, communities of colors, are enrolling at the community colleges, and the success rate isn't as great as it needs to be. So when you talk about the jobs, when you talk about economic inequality, our schools are recreating that system of inequality all the way through our systems of higher education, and they start from our K through 12 schools. I look at my school districts in my area, and I represent Crocker Highlands, Trestle Glen, wealthy area of my district, and those schools are upper middle class schools that raise to the tune of $500,000 a year for their PTA. And I have schools like Garfield Elementary in my district that are just struggling to get by, just trying to get the necessities. And so I'm really encouraged by the fact that my residents recognize this, and they started a conversation around equity and what it means for our parents of privilege to maybe help and support the PTAs and the other parent organizations, the other schools. And that didn't happen by itself. That was a concerted effort that parents and the folks at the school sort of took on. So it even plays out into our hiring. As a council member, have to deal with a lot of different issues, and we look at who we hire as a city, and even the demographics of who we hire as a city, who we employ, from our police force to our janitors, oftentimes does not reflect the diversity of our city. Certainly that's the case with our police department. Certainly that's the case across our engineering division, for example. And so that inequality gets recreated. And if we can't figure it out in Oakland, where can we figure it out? So I think that's the challenge that we have before us today.
So I want to maybe speak to this from two perspectives. First, speaking personally as a parent, so as I said, I have actually next year we'll have a third grader and a kindergartner at a school in Oakland, OUSD school. So OUSD is, elementary is about 14% white, and so the school that my child goes to, it's about 60% white. It's a school that has really gentrified the school itself. I'm not as sure about the neighborhood, but so sort of as you all were talking about, being around a lot of other kids who look like her and sort of share that both sort of a racial and class background. My concern is that it's going to not provide her with enough opportunities to sort of develop counter stories to what these messages are that are being reinforced in lots of other places, and therefore sort of has the potential for both of them to grow up and be less aware of their privilege, to think that white norms and values are the right ones, to sort of not have just enough perspective to kind of understand that although sort of as a society, there's a very sort of like white supremacist society, that's actually something that they don't want to be a part of and want to push back on. So personally, I would say like that's something that I'm invested in these issues for. And then I think also systemically in terms of right sort of across OUSD, there's a strong correlation between race and class. And so in schools where there's a large number of white kids, tend to be the schools, as you mentioned, where there's a really high concentration of resources. So I think it's important to then sort of think about this conversation as like, we're not just segregating kids, we're segregating resources, we're segregating power, we're segregating access and opportunities. So I don't think that a black or brown child their life is gonna be that much better because they happen to go to school with my daughter necessarily. But I know that I bring resources into that school, or if my child attends segregated schools, then my resources are gonna go with her. And I feel like that's, as you sort of spoke about, an injustice that deserves my attention and our attention.
So I guess I was thinking about why is this a critical issue, and it's just trying to name what is the issue. And in some ways it is, if I think about your work, right, it starts with identity, right? And it's starting with that sense of self. So, you know, it's a critical issue when we don't allow, right, as humans, we're not necessarily allowed to develop in healthy ways, right? So that's the biggest issue. So I wrote something, so I'm gonna try and like pull it out a little bit in terms of, in that moment, I'm a child of integration. I'm 54 years old, and so I remember witnessing busing happening, not necessarily for me, but like for my brother, you know, older siblings, and the violence across TV, you know, of like white women who were like yelling at kids and pulling kids off of buses or putting kids on buses. I don't really know, but it was like, and I feel like it was Boston. And so this notion of integration was really kind of scary to me from that standpoint. And then my mother was very clear that I was going to go to integrated school. So that's why I call myself a child of integration, right? Like my brother went to public schools, but I went to like these private schools that were a better chance, right? They were this opportunity for Black kids to get access to these other environments. And then that's a whole nother conversation because that was hell. And I didn't really know it then. I loved the experience of it, but in terms of identity, what happened? I was kind of moved to be in a space that wasn't necessarily a place that celebrated my identity. I had to fight oftentimes. I was the only one very often. In some kind of way, you know, my mom kind of thought that was the better thing for me. And so now I mean, fast forward, right? We're 50 years later out of that, 54 maybe. When I was talking about, I was like, why did you ask me to be on this panel? Because I don't really believe in integration. Because again, like the experience for me was not really that positive, right? The stories I heard about my father who had gone to Shaw University and my elders that were in Black neighborhoods and taught by Black teachers, and my auntie and my father who were Black teachers and taught Black students, like there was power in that. There was no power in the segregated resources, right? The difference that was being made in that. So again, I guess I just throw out for us in this conversation, or as we do our work, right, 54 some odd years later, and we talk about segregation, you know, are we gonna push where I think Jonathan's saying around, like, it's gotta be a mind shift change, it's gotta be a power shift change. You know, it's a lot more to it than just showing up, and also for me, like, I'm not interested in Black children being the ones that have to be put into spaces that are dangerous for their identity. So we gotta rethink that. And whether or not, right, like there's people that are willing to raise money or do whatever and like kind of, you know, bring about the equitable situation for all children. And yet, you know, we know that there's a tipping point, right, of when there's too many Black or brown kids that show up in white schools. And I don't see very many, like in my neighborhood that's being gentrified, okay, I gotta stop because we're gonna get to all this. Give up the mics, you know, give me the mic, shut up. Step back, step up, right? Because like I said, I don't know white families right now that are identifying themselves to go to the subpar performing schools. Now, there are amazing schools in my neighborhood, but like if you look at the test scores, you ain't going there. So I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. I would agree with everything that was said, and I will be brief so we can move on to the next question. So I'm a school person. I work in a school, and I happen to work in a school that is actually fairly racially integrated. And so what I think about it is both the opportunity and the incredible challenge that presents. And I think I'm also a parent of two students in San Francisco Unified School that start incoming kindergartner and a second grader. I think there's this incredible civic and community purpose that schools can serve to address some of the issues that Ron and Zach brought up around identity and how we see each other. Like, schools are an incredible opportunity to interrupt bias and prejudice, and especially I work in middle school at that important moment of identity development. At the same time, like dealing, being in it, doing the work every day, and Ron can speak to this, he works at my school. It's hard to figure out how do we do that in a way that's equitable and serves all students really well. And so I think that those are, I come to it with a passion for the school perspective. How do we do this, and how do we bring the right resources to make that productive?
Our country has seen a wide variety of policy initiatives to integrate communities. These include school desegregation and housing policies. What have been the greatest challenges to school and community desegregation?
I'll speak briefly and then pass it on since I have the mic. I think thinking about some of the issues that you've raised around, so I just navigated yet again the San Francisco school choice system and looking at schools and thinking about how complicated, I don't know if any of you are from San Francisco, anybody navigate know San Francisco? I don't know Oakland's as much, but it's a very complicated school choice system, and what ends up happening is the map would look very similar to what you saw for the Oakland map, is that the San Francisco as a city, by neighborhood, by housing, is very segregated. And so while there are some pieces of that assignment system designed to disrupt that, they don't work very well. And so I work at a school that actually, it's a charter school chartered by the district, so we have a random lottery citywide. And so one of the ways that our school ends up different is, well, there's a number of things. One is that it's centrally located, so this issue of who wants to go across town, not everybody can come from different places to get to it, and it's a random lottery where we can outreach throughout the city, and it's just a different scenario. Whereas when we look at it at a district level, it's a much more complicated problem. Not that our problem as a small charter school isn't complicated, but it's incredibly complicated when we look at it from a district and citywide perspective.
Barriers, right? So I'll talk about two barriers that come to mind. I think one of them is that some folks like myself bring a lot of privilege into these issues as parents, so we were able to engineer more or less where our kids go to school because we were able to afford a house in a certain neighborhood. I know people, white folks, that don't live in our neighborhood, but they also navigated the school assignment policy and figured out how to get their kids into our school through all sorts of funky stuff going on. So I'd say that's one. I also think that, like, on a more human level, I would name fear as a barrier. I think consciously or unconsciously, a lot of white people have this fear of, like, what's it going to be like if my kid goes to school with black and brown children, right? Is all these negative sort of stereotypes that we are told or taught or sort of out there, right? Is like, is this going to rub off my kid? If my kid goes to this school, are they still going to be able to get into this college? Like, is this going to have a detrimental impact on their future? And not that I don't think people, not that many that certainly I know would admit to that, or like that's not a conscious thing, but sort of subconsciously that I think it plays a significant role. And I guess what I would say is, like, I'd sort of ask a question to white parents thinking, like, all right, so like what percent of this school would you feel comfortable sending your kid to based on race, right? So, like, let's say there's 10% black kids in your kid's class. Like, you're cool with that? All right, that's fine. What if there was 20% black kids? You still okay with that? That's like a comfortable amount of diversity. If we get to 40%, 50%, is that too much, right? And I just don't think that is something that people are willing to sort of take on and interrogate. And as a result, all this other fear influences people's decisions in lots of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's the mindset, right, piece of it. So, I guess maybe just like for us to dig into this idea around the neighborhood piece, right? Because again, kind of in the context of Oakland or San Francisco, Brooklyn, DC, gentrifying cities where Black neighborhoods, predominantly folks of color. I mean, I know Black, so I'll just talk about what I know around Black, and so just kind of. Some of this blame at times around, I'll bring up the charter piece, I think, a little bit, right? Like there's this challenge in that where they've kind of blamed charter schools for segregating out, kids of color. And but they haven't talked about like the neighborhood piece at all, right? Because charter is very much about who has access and privilege and ability to kind of get around town and do what they need to do. More middle-class families probably get around, Black families, I think, or Latino families, like, get around town, and it's maybe a little bit easier. And they actually will get around town to Catholic schools. That's where my daughter went to, right, at high school. So yeah, economics is a big part of it, right? Racism kind of helps us keep, a system of impoverishment in place in a lot of ways. And so I wish that we were doing a little bit more barrier breaking around, kind of around, not switching the conversation to it's a class conversation, but talking about kind of what are those things, the economic pieces that kind of get in the way. And just to be really realistic, like our neighborhoods are segregated, so that's why our schools are that way. And so just then to think, what's wrong with that?
So I, just taking it to perspective from Oakland and in my district in particular, the district I represent mirrors the demographics of Oakland. It's about 20% Latino, about 20% Asian, about 25% African American, and the rest white. But then you look at the schools, and the chart that came up there shows very clearly that parents do keep their kids in school because that's the neighborhood school. They can walk their kids to school, and it's very integrated. I see that at my schools, and as soon as middle school happens, well, we now want to opt for the private school because that's what the other parents are doing. And so whatever best efforts we have, and there are some examples, like Oakland Tech is pretty diverse, but more often than not, parents make that choice to say, well, I don't want my kid to be experimented with, so I know that this school has a track record, and I'm not a parent, but this is what I hear, that I'm not going to take a chance on my child, so I'm going to make sure that they have this particular type of education, so I'm going to navigate that and let them go through that path. I think the greatest challenge is that people need to collectively as a community say, we're going to make a decision as a community that this is where we want to send our kids together and this is what we value, this is important. Make that decision to support and invest in that school community. I think about my experience growing up where I went to school, public school, and we had School of the Arts. And it was also McAteer High School on one campus. So we had the arts community that was very much white and artistic and had a lot of money. A lot of those students brought a lot of resources to the school. And it was great for a while. I had lots of different friends, and then somewhere about my sophomore year, those parents decided, no, we need our own campus because there's too many fights, too many suspensions, too much other stuff happening. So that school those parents ended up organizing, and they demanded from the school district that they get their own campus, which they did successfully. They took the resources, that cultural capital and real capital, financial capital, that was being invested in the schools that we all got to be a part of, and left. My high school, several years later, was shut down because it got so bad because of that issue, that flight, that white flight. The parents wanted to remove their kids. And so for a while, it was seen as a model of like integration and all this other stuff that was happening. It was a good mix, a good combination of people. The parents felt like they needed more, and that school it had too many discipline problems. as opposed to saying, yes, we're gonna solve these problems together, we're gonna come together as a community and figure out how we can support all our students at the school. And so I think that's a challenge. It's like, it's what about my kid? I don't want my kid to be experimented with. And I think that's a conversation that we ought to have in our school districts, in our community. I see this pattern sort of playing itself out again, and I see that in our schools, we're also seeing that kids check out of schools when their teachers, their administrators, their principals and staff don't reflect them, don't look like them. Oakland Unified School District is nearly 50% Latino. Nobody would know that. But our teachers are probably less than 10, 12%, okay? Something like that?
50% white teachers.
Teachers, 50% white.
50%.
So it's not reflective of the diversity of the students. And so right away that creates another barrier in that students are checking out. They don't see themselves reflected in their school community. So, you know, for a lot of folks, if you can't see it, you don't know how to navigate. You can't be it if you can't see it. And so that's another real challenge, is how do we get teachers to live in an expensive area like Oakland to actually teach our babies, to teach our young folks. And a lot of times, people who can come here and settle, maybe they don't have that college debt. Maybe they have parent help from their families that they're able to teach and do that thing. But for a lot of communities of color, sometimes teaching isn't, and that's not what you're pushed into, because that's not lucrative, even though many people would want to give back. Many people would want to, but economically, they just can't make it happen. So that's a real challenge, is what do we value and what are we willing to do to make sure that we integrate our schools?
So I'm actually really happy that you brought up the point about, you know, like what should integration actually look like, because I think that, yeah, I was wondering if anyone else felt that way. So I think that, you know, it is definitely an issue regarding class and race, but I think that the numbers and the data demonstrates that, you know, even regardless of someone's class, that your race could be a very important factor. It is a very important factor when it comes to discipline, when it comes to resources at school districts. And students, you know, oftentimes have issues being able to be their authentic selves and keep their cultural identity when they're put into these situations where, you know, maybe a school district, for instance, doesn't have as many black students, or there aren't that many black teachers, because the teachers don't know what to do with, you know, black or Latino students. And so, you know, some of the cases that I litigated and had to work on, you know, dealt with just that, you know, students, like black students having traditional black hairstyles, and they're getting disciplined under dress code issues because their hair is distracting. And so, you know, when you think of issues like that, that's ridiculous, but those are some of the challenges that happen when you have, you know, desegregation, you have students going to different schools, and the proper training around cultural sensitivity, around implicit and explicit bias isn't happening at these schools. And so you basically set the students up to fail because they're more likely going to be disciplined at a higher rate. And then, you know, there's all these studies around like black girls in schools that are suburban who are being disciplined at higher rates as well because they are automatically deemed as being aggressive and angry and loud, even though they're doing some of the same things that all other students are doing. And then, unfortunately, in California, we haven't completely gotten rid of willful defiance. So, as maybe people in here know, willful defiance is basically a catch-all discipline citation for students that students can get. And, you know, more often than not, the students who are, you know, cited with willful defiance are students of color And oftentimes when they're cited with willful defiance, it's with teachers who aren't, they're just not equipped to, they need more training. And so that's one of the challenges is that we have, for instance, this issue within the education code that allows for teachers to just suspend students literally for willful defiance, and it's not really defined what that even means. So another thing that is, I think, a challenge is that, as most of us know, California localized funding several years ago through the LCAP and LCFF process in order to make sure that school districts locally, they were able to make sure that the schools that needed the funding the most, that they were actually receiving those resources. And I think that, one of the challenges is actually making sure that that LCAP funding is reaching the schools that need it the most. And, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't happen the way that it should. So that's one of the challenges is, making sure, and I guess it's an opportunity for community members to make sure that they are involved in that process, because there is funding and it is localized, but it needs to make sure that it's reaching the schools that need it the most. As it relates to, back to discipline and issues around discipline, so there are federal complaints that can be filed and state Department of Education complaints that can be filed. And the California Department of Education makes it extremely difficult for students to file cases regarding discrimination. It's very hard to challenge discrimination that happens at your school in California with the California Department of Education. Part of the reason why is because it's not clear what they're looking for. And so that's a challenge here in the state. And unfortunately, because of how the administration is right now, who knows what would happen with a federal Office of Civil Rights complaint with the Department of Education if you are filing a claim about discrimination that's happening at your school. So, even though, of course, you want to have the resources there, but you also want to have those mechanisms to hold people accountable within the school, and if they're not available, then it kind of perpetuates systems that lead to white supremacy and oppression of people of color. And then I'd say the last thing is around deseg issues. So most of the deseg plans in general were in the South. Most of them actually weren't in California. So the Department of Education, monitored a lot of schools in the South and on the East Coast regarding how they were actually integrating schools and how they were desegregating schools. And California hasn't really had that much oversight relating to that. So it's a different kind of frontier when we talk about integration, we talk about desegregation here, because that history around deseg plans in general, it's just not here in the state, and it's definitely not up here in this area. So yeah, I think that those are some of the challenges, and I think that there are places for for opportunities, but it just makes it difficult when you don't have that training, when you haven't really thought about what it means to have Black students or other students of color in those spaces. And then also the other piece too is, of course, intersectionality, because when you are a student of color, you're bringing your whole self, you're bringing your identity. You might also be an LGBTQ student, or you might be a student with special needs. And I think that oftentimes schools don't take in, well, I'm not going to say here, but some schools don't take into consideration what it means to be intersectional when we have these conversations about desegregation, when we talk about integration, and making sure that that cultural sensitivity and that implicit and explicit bias training talks about what it means for a student to bring their whole selves.
So all of you have kind of problematized the issue of school segregation, which was really important for us to understand. where, I guess, I want to ask this question maybe in two ways. In your particular fields, what is being done currently to address this issue? What's happening? Is there anything happening? And what effect has that had or not had, or what has been the hope of that? Like, what's kind of give us an idea of what is actually being done to kind of address the problems that you're raising?
So Mike is down here. So I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing in some of my wealthier schools. PTA has formed an equity committee, for example, and they are having conversations about what that means and what that looks like in an area that is so segregated economically, and to the point that that school recognizes that, we have $500,000 in our reserve, and you know what? These budget cuts as a school district, we can absorb that. But this other school can't. So how can we help that other school financially and help those distribute those resources? So I'm encouraged by that. I'm not going to be naive to think that that's going to solve everything or that's going to continue. That might change with whoever, the new PTA council that comes into place. I want to just give a plug for ethnic studies in our schools. I think it's important that our students recognize that across racial groups, there are a lot of similar struggles amongst different communities. And I think there comes a sense of pride. And once you understand your own, I was angry. I was angry as a kid. I was like, why are all the Mexicans getting treated like this? And why are all the white people being treated like this? And why are these kids doing that? Why are they taking all the AP classes? How come I'm not in this class?
And so I feel like that's a hella tall order for white educators. Like, shit, like you gotta get out your own way in order to really do that. So I know we're gonna keep talking about, and talking with ourselves about how we grow and develop that, but I think it's in the naming and the courage to do that.
I like that you're talking about naming it. Like, I feel like at a school level, when I'm thinking about it, the first step is naming the issue. And just to give some examples, think about one of you raised something about access to AP classes. So I used to work for a high school, and we did a whole initiative on who's in AP classes at our high school. It's a tiny little high school, only about 450 kids. It's the Gateway High School. It's a high school that is tied to my middle school. And as a faculty, did a whole project on how can we make sure that access to AP classes mirrors the population of students in our school, which was pretty reflective of the city of San Francisco. And it was a lot of work. It was work with kids, parents, and teachers, and administrators, because there are so many barriers that have been there for so long to thinking about who's ready for an AP class, and what does it mean for my AP class if I have a more diverse group of students in here, and what does that mean for the content that I'm teaching and how I teach it and all that. So I think that's one thing about naming. And then another thing that I think is important to name is when we are talking about desegregating schools, how are we also talking about we've talked about things like affinity groups of students and families, so that there's a community that sustains and recognizes who you are some of the time, and then when you come together, you're more supported when we all come together. And so trying to figure out but those are things that we can't figure out until we have diverse communities in our schools, but how do we sustain those?
So some of the things that I'd say for my organization and that some of the cases that I've worked on relating to this issue, some of them are regarding funding. So last year we actually held Fresno Unified School District accountable for almost $15 million that was being misallocated under their LCFF and their LCFF funding under their LCAP, because that was a lot of money that was supposed to go to students of color, foster youth, low-income students, and so we filed a complaint with the school district, and of course they were like, well, you know, we didn't do anything wrong. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll ask the California Department of Education what they think about it, and they agreed with me. And so, you know, I mean, so that was one, and the reason that I took that case is because we were hearing from parents and from students that, you know, there were students of color who were going to different schools in the school district, and they weren't getting the funding, they weren't getting the resources that they needed. And so, you know, I think that money oftentimes is very important when it comes to these kinds of conversations. So, you know, me and my other colleagues, we do work around resources for students and looking at LCAP plans and making sure that that money is actually reaching the students that need it the most. We also work on, you know, other kinds of complaints as well that come in. Like I stated, there was an issue with, there was an issue with a student who was suspended because his hair was considered distracting. And it was just like one line in his hair. And so, you know, I work on cases that help to make sure that students can be their authentic self in the school, you know, system. I mean, the California Education Code makes it very clear that, you know, school districts and schools are supposed to be supportive of students being their authentic selves, and it's more expansive than the protections that are even available federally. So it really should, and that school districts actually have this affirmative obligation to combat racism, you know, in other issues as well. So if that mandate is already there for school districts to make sure that this is happening, then, you know, really that is on everyone who's involved to make sure that, you know, if there's going to be integration that's happening, that maybe that means training for your teachers, maybe that means checking people about their implicit and explicit biases, maybe that means, you know, making sure that those cultural sensitivity trainings happen at a time when all the teachers are going to be able to attend, and that they're happening regularly. And so those are some of the things that we work on. We, you know, do trainings with school districts as well. We talk with them about how, for instance, their dress codes can perpetuate systems of oppression for students of color, because oftentimes, you know, school districts, unfortunately, those dress codes are, is like one of the #1 ways that students don't feel welcome, is to be suspended for some ridiculous reason in the dress code that's more than likely being used in a way that, you know, perpetuates racism. And then also, and so we've also worked on cases around, like for instance, there were 2 Black students who wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter in a yearbook, and, you know, a principal was like, no, you can't talk about Black Lives Matter, it's controversial. And so, you know, we were going to file a lawsuit, but we were able to resolve it very short of that, and educating them that, you know, when it comes to like free speech issues, that oftentimes those controversial issues are oftentimes, you know, used in a way that perpetuates racism and systems of oppression towards students of color. And so, you know, especially now, I think, with all of the conversation around what does free speech mean for students, what does this mean, controversial issues, just so everyone's aware, you know, oftentimes is used in a way that perpetuates racism. And so that's an opportunity as well, to like further dig in deeper to make sure that students in these different schools are supported.
Awesome, thank you. So we have one more question before we start taking questions from the audience. The last one is, what is the #1 way we in the audience can make a difference? What is the #1 way we can make a difference?
Go first. 'Cause I have notes. What was the question again? No. Both? What's the #1 way in the audience you can make a difference? Be willing to do the internal work around race. Make a commitment if you're gonna be anti-racist or not. You really have to develop right, there's a whole process. You have to really develop some will to do that, and I lean into, the two things I talk about is will and skill, and there's so much more to that. And I think, the skill part, right, is that, it's difficult work to do, and it can be really painful and really uncomfortable. And so the notion of being, right, comfortable with being uncomfortable is really, so important, which is why, the affinity work, to me, is really important. Because, you gotta have people that you can lean into and be like, whoa, with, So very interesting political thing, and I actually won't say any names, is happening, right now, out into the public airway, someone with a significant amount of privilege called out another person. And what is hilarious to me, it's not really hilarious, you laugh to keep from crying, is that a week ago, that very same person with the privilege, I was in a room where someone said the exact same thing about her. The exact same thing about her. And what it feels like, I think, for me as a person of color, to feel like that someone with so much privilege and entitlement can get airway and airspace to do that and not think that that is not detrimental. In particular, if you're in a leadership role. In particular, if you're guiding, if you call yourself an anti-racist. There's ways that you have to behave, and I don't care if you feel like you need to speak the truth on me, or whatever that is, but there's a place to do that in a way that we don't shame and blame people, right? Because that's the really hard part of the work, because we all get woke and we feel like we want to, no. So the skills are really, really important. I think that, because I think, again, and it's also long work, right? It is really long work. It's not, we have to be comfortable with that, right? That there's going to be these points in which we have to keep coming back to the table, and we have to keep growing into it and uncovering our belief systems, because there's so much unconscious stuff, right? And things that again, Black folks walk around with a lot of this, right? The ways in which, they're talking about now, you intellectuals and you scientists and all that stuff, right? This trauma is in our DNA, right? The trauma that we're reinforcing right now in our streets with our kids, experiencing violence and things like that, and you're seeing it in the classrooms, and you want 5 social workers around every child. It doesn't work, but I'm just saying, right, it's there, and so that's really difficult work, and so it's gonna take a little bit of money, obviously, it's gonna take some training, but just a lot of love, and something to just kind of where we can hold these spaces a little bit better for our children and then for ourselves, because we're we're all responding and reacting to it, and figuring out, again, the best ways, I think, to do that without harming each other in the process of doing it, because I think people do care. So yes, I think I would do your own work, and don't ask children to do work that you're not willing to do either, please. Did you go? I'm sorry, no.
Okay. So I think, echoing what everyone said, I think that one of the #1 ways that the audience can make a difference is to just be aware and also, to be available and open, and in some instances to be an ally. So if there are parents or students who are saying, hey, these are issues, we need to raise these in school board meetings and in public settings, be willing to do that and be willing to share those stories and to help to, strengthen the conversation around desegregation, around integration, and around, discrimination against students of color, because, I realize that public officials have a very tough, job as far as they're having to hear from the community. They're they're having to like understand like what are the issues, and if people aren't speaking out, then it makes it difficult for them as well. And so I think that, you know, one is just being there, being aware, and then if there are actual actionable steps, like if you can file, you know, a UCP complaint because it's necessary and you see that it's necessary in a particular school, then you can do that. I mean, for issues around discrimination, it can't be anonymous. You have to actually name the person who is potentially like causing the harm for like obvious legal reasons. But if there's like an issue around resources, you can actually file those anonymously. If you're trying to, you know, like if you're like, hey, I see that there is inequitable resources that are happening, and this like needs to change, and if you've already tried to have those conversations and it's not working, well, you know, it doesn't cost any money to file a UCP complaint. It's free. And you don't need a lawyer to do it as well. So I think that, you know, that's one of the number one ways that you can make a difference.
I got an idea. Support Camp Common Ground. I think what the organization really strives to do is to really have those conversations early on and bring people together. And so that, you know, having tough conversations is important, and youth are more willing to have those tough conversations than adults are. Kids are, young people are truly have not only resilient, but can be very straight up in a way that adults can be sometimes. And so as adults, I think we have a responsibility to support our young people in that way. And as people in this room, to be able to, when someone calls out race, to not automatically think that that's just somebody playing the race card, but to actually take a critical look and say, what is that person talking about? What is their vantage point? Put yourself in their perspective. Why is that student acting out? What is going on at home? What is leading to this sort of behavior? And trying to dig a little bit deeper than just the reaction of go to the principal's office, or here's a referral, or whatever the case may be, whatever the first line of discipline would be. And then enlist other allies to have those conversations as well. I think that it's incumbent for adults and parents to, we have a group in Oakland called Neighbors for Racial Justice, who have been really instrumental in calling out the racism on Nextdoor, and who, through their work, actually really made a difference. They came to City Hall, we heard them, and I will say, I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not on Nextdoor, so I didn't understand what they were talking about. But there were some real issues there of people being called out just because, look at Starbucks. What happened to Starbucks a couple of days ago, right? So we need to be able to have those conversations and have that space and be very clear that these issues are still happening, and have those conversations. So I would say that thank you, Camp Common Ground, for the work that you do, and I hope that this is a model that can be replicated and spread throughout for all our kids.
So I guess like I was imagining, I'm not great with metaphors, but let's say someone had a car filled with gas, right? And they had a destination in mind, call it college or something, right? And another person was like, hey, I don't have any gas in my car, I'm trying to get there too. Can you hook me up? The first thought for the person with the gas in the car might think is like, well, if I give you half my gas, then I'm not getting there, right? Whereas I feel like the shift to make is to think about like, well, we could all just ride in the same car and all get there together, right? So it's like shifting this idea from what's best for me to what's best for us, or sort of how can our collective success include my success too, so that I don't end up having to think of this as like, I'm only down to do this if it's going to benefit my kid, and since it's not, then right? That's a place I think for us to push ourselves, some of us in particular.
And I would second, supporting groups that work with youth to do this, Camp Common Ground, your schools that you're connected to, the school communities, like what resources can we support them with? And then I think also just, as there are so many opportunities to participate in school communities and groups and be a voice for racial justice. And I'm just thinking about some of the examples that were said tonight, like the PTA Equity Committee that you described, I think is an opportunity. My kid just had to figure out how to get him into kindergarten. That was 10 million opportunities to have a conversation with another parent because people kept talking about how are we going to navigate this system? Well, let's talk about where we want our kids to go to school, And that was hard for me, honestly. Sometimes I had to be like, I don't really want to talk about this kindergarten thing again. I don't want to talk about how you might not send your kid to public school. Like, I really just don't want to talk about that, but I'm gonna because it's important. So I think there's so many opportunities in the day for each of us to speak to these things.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you everyone. We're not done with the panel yet, but we want to thank you. So before we open the question, just a shift in agenda so we end on time. We are not going to do the small group, but in Camp Common Ground fashion, we have an alternative every day at camp. We are actually going to do three things. One is we are going to print out all of the notes from the panel, like all the answers you heard, and give you a copy to take home so you can review it. We'll also email that out. That's one thing. The second thing we're going to do is Zach and myself and the board will have a discussion about a particular, like our next event that we may have for adults. And maybe that would stem from the action steps that you all named. So we would have an event that was grounded in that action step, and we would re-invite the people here to attend that event so we are more action-oriented as a group. Does that make sense? Second thing, so that's the second thing we'll do. But we'll contact you about that later once we figure that out, but that's something we're committed to do. And then was there a third thing? I think there was just two. Okay. So, we are going to have a quick chance to do questions. The way we're just going to do this is really straightforward. If you have a question, we won't have tons of time for questions, but if you have a question, please raise your hand and I can bring you the mic as well. Or Zach will bring it to you.
So my question is, I taught at Cambridge Academy. I was a 5th grade Lincoln Learning teacher. And it's interesting to see the population there is like a lot of black students, Muslim population, and stuff like that. And I have these moments where like one of my students called the other student a nigger, and then I'm like, and then they call the other one a sand nigger. You know what I mean? It's just like these moments. And I think, like, how do you really connect with the family structure? You know what I mean? And it's like, it's more than just, because like these kids are acting out from like pop culture, from experiences, from real moments, right? And how do you like, what does that mean? I don't even know what I'm asking right now. But I think I'm trying to process. Like, when I seen that, I was just like, first of all, you calling him a nigger and you a sand nigger. You know what I mean? Like, truthfully. And it's just really interesting to see how race plays out in the classroom and how much, like, in 5th grade, they need more counseling and support. And then, like, I think they need so much counseling and support, and I want to see that more. Because like the school's like, oh, we're gonna get a counselor. Like, do you understand these kids? They need multiple counselors to support what they're going through. So like, especially in middle school, they need some talking. You know what I mean? So I don't even know what I was asking, but I was just like, what do you think like counseling looks like in the school system, that sort of support and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're uncomfortable with the word nigga.
Who, me?
Yeah.
I'm not uncomfortable with it. I have a
N-word,
kind of studies background. I'm good.
But I mean, yeah, it's in pop culture and it's those things, but it's in
their culture. Like, I mean, I don't know that it's because they need therapy. Like, I mean, it's a part of our culture. I mean, we know that, like, Black folks say the N-word to one another, and it's okay.
Well, I'm not even talking about
I
the
mean,
words.
you might not feel like it's okay, but you see what I'm saying? I'm just saying, but that's a part of their culture. And I think, I don't know, is it sand, is that like an Arabic person or a Yemenis person?
A person who's just not, looks like it.
Oh, they're light skinned? It's a color thing? Okay. So that's the work, right? That's naming the racial work. And I say, what made you uncomfortable about that? What a trigger for you? How did you feel about it? What brought up your beliefs? Intellectually, how did you need to deal with it? What actions did you want to take? So it's like, it's allowing us to begin to kind of have the skill to kind of hold that space for them and correct it in whatever kinds of ways. My pushback around a therapist for every child or a case manager or 5 or 6 of them, lined up on these kids is that, I mean, to me, that's pathologizing kids, right, on some level. I go to therapy every week, right? I'm in there because racism is for real. It makes me sad. It makes me depressed. It makes me not want to get up in the morning, right? So, yeah, our kids are doing it. They're feeling it. They're feeling a whole bunch of other things. So, I don't know exactly what you were asking, but I do think that, like, the discomfort for you is important to look at, if I were to throw that back at you. I like the other one.
I can talk loud. Okay. Yeah, I think that, it is actually very important to, like, acknowledge the struggles that teachers face, because it plays out in a way that can harm students. And if teachers are saying, like, these are the resources that we need to be successful, well then, like, there needs to be, like, a conversation either at the school level or at the district level about making sure that teachers feel comfortable in the classroom and that those resources are there. Because, I mean, even if it's like, okay, like, I don't feel comfortable, it's still you're still gonna be a teacher there. This issue is gonna continue to come up. And I think that the kinds of trainings and the kinds of counseling services and the kinds of resources need to be, like the LCAP intended, individualized and specialized to what teachers are facing at those schools. And so I think that part of what you can do, hopefully your principal is, like hearing what you're saying, and that, that conversation is making its way up, so that maybe there can be resources that are available. And I realize that, there's never enough money, but I think that those are real issues, and if they're playing out in a way that might, like harm a student's learning experience, that it's more critical to have those resources that are available, and that teachers need to be very much more a part of, like, those conversations about what resources are actually needed at the school. And so you should demand that, honestly. And I know that there's, like, the teachers' unions and all of that, but there are LCAP funds that are supposed to be for these types of issues. So,
Thank you. And I think we'll have time for one more question, and then we'll close out.
Thank you all for your being here. So my question is related to the issue of solutions. I really like the idea and concept of the LCAP and LCFF, and even all of the different things that have been mentioned here, but I am definitely someone who is not for students or people of color having to, like, police and sort of help everyone else figure it out. I'm curious more about, like, the systems level stuff, and so given all of your different sort of vantage points, I'm curious specifically, and I'm warning you, like, I think this is a hard question, so I feel like we will all appreciate if you're like, I'm not ready to answer that publicly or whatever, but how can we use, where can we push on transparency in how money is actually spent? Because I think a lot of people and teachers and the best teachers, or not even the best, the ones at the top, like, hide things, and so we don't actually really know. Like, when I go to I'm in West Contra Costa County, when I go and I see their like reports, I'm like, this ain't telling me nothing. And they think they're like checking some box on transparency, but I don't necessarily know what I should be asking for, especially as someone who doesn't have a child in the school, but you know, as a community member. But you know, what are things we people can be asking about to get at what transparency looks like when we're talking, whether it's teachers' materials or salaries or these professional development and whatever happens in them, or you know, police, or you know, those people in the schools. Can you give us some specifics around that?
So I just want to, I was a community college trustee before I got on the school, on the city council, and I was always surprised how much money we actually spend. Most of the money went to teacher salaries. That was like about, I don't know, 85% of our budget was teacher salaries, and only about 15% was operations and sort of facilities and everything else. And then when you dig deeper, it's like, okay, who are those teachers, and how long have they been tenured, and you know, so you have to dig in deeper. But I think the place to look is always to look at the budgets and look at the money, how it's being spent, and figuring out. I don't think it's always a coincidence that better resource schools have a higher paying, more senior tenured faculty at their schools compared to some of our schools in the flats that have turnover every 2 years. They have these programs that come in and people come and go, and there's no continuity of leadership, and there's no continuity of staff for those students that are there. So I would always look at the budgets.
So I guess this is a plug. I actually just released the report maybe last week, detailing like what happened with the Fresno LCAP, and then also some recommendations what to look for in LCAP and what to look for in the LCFF process. And so it just like actually just goes through like all of those different issues. So it's on the ACLUNC.org website, and you can read the report. And it also outlines student and parent stories and their reactions to like what happened, and the recommendations that are in there are based on our conversations with students, parents, and community members, so that, you know, can be a starting point. Another place to look is like there's the LCAP. There's also sometimes funding that they don't put in the LCAP. So some of the federal funding, depending on the school district, sometimes unfortunately they're not as transparent about how that federal funding is being used. And I think it's worth pushing the school district to be transparent about not just the state funding that they're getting, but also the federal funding, and all sources of funds. You can also file a Public Records Act request. And so that is, you know, something that you can file with the information officer for the school district, and you can just actually ask them about budget, ask them about the LCAP, ask them how those funds are being used. And, you know, so sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but hopefully if you're, you know, pretty specific with your request, they can get that information to you pretty quickly. And, you know, you can also ask for it, you know, ask for specific data points that you're interested in as well. And and so I think that those are like just some of the main ways that you should be able to find most of the information on the county Office of Education website, as well as the school district website. And then the California Department of Education also holds some of this information as well for your school district.
Awesome, thank you so much. We're just gonna do a little quick turn and talk, and then we're gonna do a short closing. So because we're teachers, the idea of you just listening this whole time, like I'm gonna talk to each other, come on, that can't happen. So we're just gonna ask you to turn to the person next to you and just briefly just share something that you either really agreed with or really disagreed with from the panel, and why. So just quickly turn and talk to someone.